So, Stephen, you've had a variety of breakthroughs recently, especially since COVID, remarkably. If you had to pin a majority of the recent breakthroughs of yours to one key insight, what would it be? So, for instance, it could be the introduction of hypergraphs or the coining of computational irreducibility or the hiring of Jonathan Garrard.
Jonathan's been very helpful for sure. No, I mean, I think, look, the first statement is sort of, it's computation all the way down. That computation is the way of thinking about the world. If you look at how have we formalized the world, it's kind of, the invention of human language is a formalization of the world. Logic is a formalization of the world. Mathematics is a formalization of the world. Computation is a formalization of the world. And, in terms of what has allowed me to get where I've gotten to, a large part of that is taking seriously that idea of computation as a way of formalizing the world and building tools, building our whole Wolfram language technology stack and so on around that idea of computation as a way to formalize the world. Now, once you've had that idea, you start thinking about, well, what about physics? How do I formalize that? Then, so the next big fact is principle of computational equivalence, computational irreducibility. Those are very closely related. That's a key intuitional idea that I, originally had in the early 1980s, that, is a driver for a lot of other things. In more recent times, I would say that this whole business about multi-computation, understanding the Rulliad, understanding the role of observers, it's kind of this idea of the relationship of sort of underlying computation and the Rulliad, the sort of entangled limit of all possible computational processes, understanding the interplay between that and what we're like as observers. The fact that you can derive science from that is really pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. And it did not see that coming. I mean, if you'd asked me even 4 years ago or something, did I think we will be able to derive general relativity? And, well, I knew we could derive general relativity from underlying hypergraph evolution. I've known that since the 1990s. I thought it was graphs back then, but hypergraphs are easier. But the concept that there is some that there's an inevitability to these kinds of laws of physics for observers like us, I really didn't see that coming. And I'm sure that it has echoes and resonances in lots of things that people have imagined, particularly a couple of thousand years ago or more, in sort of early thinkings about philosophy and how it relates to our descriptions of the world. The main thing that we've achieved in the last couple of thousand years is, we can run computer simulations and actually, see how this works with some concreteness, so to speak, rather than having just some sort of vaguer idea about what's going on. But I would say that for me, this kind of the role of the observer, the idea of multi-computation, the Rulliad, the kind of, the inevitability of science the way it is, those are important ideas. And I think, I suspect that a lot of the technical detail of hypergraph rewriting, all this kind of thing, is a very useful way to get there. But in the end, it will be possible to state a lot of these things in terms of, it's one of these things where you can think about computation theory. And if you don't have Turing machines or something like that, you can't concretely talk about it. You're just sort of still just vaguely saying things. You need a concrete basis on which to discuss things. But in the end, the core ideas are independent of that basis. And so it is, I think, with the whole observer theory, Rulliad, sort of, inevitability of laws of physics and so on story.
Yeah, many of these ideas are like fountains where other ideas cascade out of them. So you mentioned the power of computation or thinking about computation as fundamental, equivalencing computational irreducibility, observers, multi-computation, Reuliad. So let's call those ideas fountain ideas for the sake of this conversation. What recipe would you give your former self to have some of these fountain ideas more often?
There's a whole bunch of computational irreducibility, and what ends up happening as one tries to come up with these things. I think I don't think I'm batting too horribly in terms of having these ideas with decent frequency. I mean, because frankly, some of these ideas, if you have them too quickly, there's not a lot you can do with them. They need a certain degree of development before they're very meaningful. I mean, so I think that there's a maximum rate. In fact, one of the things that has been a frustration to me recently is that there are so many of these things coming that, I'm writing about all these different things. And I think some of the things I'm writing are quite, important and seeds for a lot of other things, but I'm going so quickly that they don't have as much chance to develop as they probably need. So I think there's a maximum rate of generating sort of, these potentially big ideas. And if you exceed that rate, it's kind of just totally confusing and you can't achieve anything.
So it's not that when you saturate it, some just fall to the wayside. It's that somehow it's like spinning plates and all of them fall?
No, I mean, if you do it too fast, then it's just like, well, I have this idea, but each of these ideas needs a certain development. I mean, when one first, one of the things that I personally spend a lot of effort on is sort of cleaning ideas. That is, when I have some vague sense of an idea, it's like, what is the essence of that idea? What is the really simple, I could say it in a sentence or two version of that idea? And that takes a while. I mean,
yeah.
maybe a smarter me would be able to do that more quickly, but it's figuring out what's the essence, what's important, what's not. I mean, I've had the good fortune, I suppose, in my life to do that a whole bunch of times. And in fact, the thing I do for a living, designing and building our computational language, is a kind of that critically relies on that skill, because that's all about taking kind of all these things that one might think about computationally and kind of crispening them down to these kind of primitives that we implement in our language and so on. So that's I get to do this pretty much every day, and I've been doing it kind of every day for 40 years. And that's a useful experience to have if your goal is sort of the crispening of ideas for kind of basic intellectual development, so to speak. I think that's one thing. I mean, another thing for me is tools. And, when I can do an experiment with Wolfram language, I've built this whole technology stack. Conveniently, millions of other people use it too. But first and foremost, I kind of built it so I could do stuff myself, kind of my sort of personal superpower, so to speak. And it works really well. And it's really necessary for, I could not, many, many things I've discovered, I would never have had the built-in intuition to figure out that the way they work is the way they actually work. I discovered the way they work by doing experiments, computational experiments. And I wouldn't have had the confidence, actually, even if I'd imagined that was the way things might work. I wouldn't have had the confidence to say that really is the way things work without having seen them as the result of an experiment. And I think it's kind of I might have imagined, although I didn't, back in the beginning of the 1980s, that, really simple computational rules could lead to complicated behavior. I didn't imagine that. I actually imagined the opposite. And had it not been for the fact that I had explicit computer experiments where I could just plainly see that's what's going on, I wouldn't have believed it. So that's a necessary piece. If it was purely, I'm going to sit and think about this stuff just in my own mind, I would never have got there. And it's the same with tons of things I've been doing. So I would say that probably the two things that have been important to me are the tools, having built the sort of tall tower of tools that allow me to do experiments, get intuition and so on. That's one thing. And to even the very act of putting my thoughts into computational language is a way of crystallizing what I'm talking about. It's like, well, I vaguely imagine this and that and the other. Well,
Interesting.
Let me
Right,
write a
right.
function that does that. And it's kind of like when people say, I'm gonna write down a mathematical proof. Yeah, it's kind of relevant to see the proof and to check you got the right answer. But more important is the very fact that you're formulating things. The setup is the important part. It's kind of like when when people are doing, I don't know, math exercises or something, and they get the setup totally wrong. It's a different story than if, they did a calculation slightly wrong and they got this minus sign in the wrong place. It's the kind of like, can you conceptualize things in this formal way? And by the way, computation and computational language are this amazing superpower that we have, developed, so to speak, for kind of crystallizing thoughts, human thoughts, into something that has a lot more power. And not only but both because it's a way of sort of formalizing what we're talking about, and because then we can have a computer help us to zoom forward with what we're thinking about. But so, for me, it's kind of the tools, the sort of crystallization of ideas from representing them in basically in Wolfram language, then the actual running of it to see what happens and to get intuition that I wouldn't otherwise have had. And I suppose the other thing is the effort to sort of get to the essence of things, say what is the core point that this all comes from, so to speak. And I suppose that for me, that is somewhat related to exposition. And, I spend quite a lot of effort writing things, trying to explain things, doing live streams, all those kinds of things. And for me, that's a part of the process of kind of grinding things down to their essence. Like even in this conversation we've had, I've said a few things that I haven't thought to say before, so to speak, that I think are useful ways to kind of crystallize some thoughts that I've had in the past. And that's, that is my typical experience, is that sort of the act of exposition is an important driver for sort of getting to the essence of things. But that's for me, the other big thing is what's the essential point? Now, this question of, I sort of carry around with me lots of things where I mean to figure this out someday. And I'm sort of gradually accumulating knowledge about those things. Part of what I need to do is, in any new field that you work in, there is some kind of sort of local intuition in that field. And unless you've kind of marinated in the thing for a while, it's hard to have that local intuition. I mean, I've been interested in the foundations of biology, foundations of economics, things about neuroscience and so on. In each of these areas, sort of slowly over the years, I've been trying to get sort of general knowledge and intuition about these areas, because otherwise you really, it's very hard to, when you say, I'm now going to go and figure out the essence of economics, for example, unless you have some sort of big intuitional understanding of what economics is about, it's very hard, at least for me, it's very hard to go and do that. If you're just like, well, somebody says the definition of economics is this. Okay, that's nice, but they might be wrong. And unless you've got some sort of more broader view of what's in that field, it's really hard to dig down and not sort of be channeled into the things that people already said were going on. So that's a slow process for me. I mean, there are many fields where I've been following them for, I don't know, some of them nearly 50 years now. Slowly trying to get intuition. I mean, physics, for example, is a good example. I mean, the fact that, I can make, decent, can do the things we've done in fundamental physics is, I think, completely dependent on the fact that, I, learnt research physics when I was, as it happens, pretty young. You can talk to me about quantum field theory or general relativity or something like that, and I know all the technical stuff. And that, while that's not something that we use every day in moving forward with the physics project, for instance, the fact that one has that background knowledge of roughly how things work. I mean, like Jonathan and I were just talking about some really nice stuff he's been doing with using our models to do simulations of space-time. And, we're talking about, why do these things happen this way? He sees these things in these simulations. Why does it happen that way? It's very important in those conversations that I, for example, and he also, but, kind of knows the whole sort of shtick of how typical general relativity works, how typical quantum field theory works, and so on. Without that, it's really hard to, I think, reason rationally in this area. If you have to invent everything for yourself, you'll never get there. But, once one is sort of living in this environment of, well, there's a certain amount of ambient knowledge that's been developed, then you have the chance, if you understand that ambient knowledge well, and that's one of the issues. If you just know kind of I read this textbook and I got this one point of view about things, that's not enough. If you want to make foundational progress in a field, you really have to understand it in some quite deep level that's typically your own internalized understanding, that isn't the thing that you just learned from a textbook type thing. And for a lot of these fields, it takes a while to get there. And it takes, often for me, it takes doing practical projects in these fields where you're kind of like, for example, in economics, working on things related to blockchain and distributed blockchain and so on, helped me. I don't think I'm there yet, but it helped me to kind of get an understanding of, I don't know, the role of liquidity and what that means, and the notion of single prices for things and so on. To have that sort of practical, in the weeds experience in this area, and to see sort of how things work out in practice, really important in being able to get a sort of bigger foundational theoretical idea about what's going on.
If you enjoyed this TOE clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for TOE Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core TOE community. You'll also receive my top 10 TOEs. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.